everyone. Sorry for the change of plans with class today, but it'll be fun. We'll be looking at the second wave of feminism and really talking about Betty Friedan and the way that we're thinking about the feminine mystique. So this will be focused on that as well as some sort of a larger discussion about the second wave of feminism and art, and then we'll discuss that as well. So in 1941, the United States enters World War II, which really helps to sort of end their Great Depression as well. And this is really where we enter in on our conversation about the feminine mystique and Betty Friedan, because what we see in the mainstream, commercially, socially, is this drastic change between how women are depicted before and during the war to after the war. So you can see images like this in Life magazine covers showing women as heroes, as the nurses, as some of the hardworking individuals behind World War II. As well as such famous figures like Rosie the Riveter, right? She is part of World War II, and their dialogue about sort of women. As men go off to war in Europe in World War II, women have to take over these roles in the workforce to do the work that men were doing as well. And so you have these very powerful images where the government, society is trying to engage with women and make them feel like they're part of something bigger. And so you have these famous images like Rosie the Riveter becoming one of them. She is indeed she is based on a real woman, Naomi Parker Fraley from 1942, who showed up to work very fashionably in a factory and was replicated and made into the Rosie the Riveter image. This is her years later on the right. You also have famous books coming out that kind of aid in the sexual revolution of women to some extent. We're going to see why that's problematic as well. But you have Alfred Klinsley coming out with his books in 1948 and 1953. He was a biologist and sexologist who founded the Institute of Sex Research in 1947 and really started developing an understanding of female sexuality and breaking down a lot of information surrounding female orgasms. There's a very famous movie called Klinsley where Liam Neeson plays him in the movie, if you wanted to watch that. It's pretty good. But he actually had women and men engaging in sexual acts in offices as a part of research. So his work came under a lot of fire, as you can imagine. There's also some comedic books that came out. Here's his Time magazine cover about the birds and the bees, which I feel like is weird. But on the right, photographic reaction to the Kinsey report. That's supposed to be sort of comedic and funny. About women sort of reacting to what they learn. Kinsey also made a scale for sexual orientation based on heterosexual versus homosexual. I guess there are like tests on the internet about how you can sort of show which one you are based on the Kinsey test. But a lot of his information was collected through like researching and interviewing people and understanding their past. It's not really based particularly on some sort of particular set of questions you can ask necessarily. So this was engaging with more sort of open sexuality for women, slightly more in the 30s and 40s. We also have the March on Washington occurring in 1963. I wanted to mention it because we're going to have to come back to it, I think, probably in next week, because I want to finish conversations about the feminine mystique and make sure that we cover sort of Black women's role in the civil rights movement as well, which at times works in conjuncture and separate from the second wave of feminism. So when we move into the feminine mystique by Betty Friedan and start looking at what this woman problem is, right? And we start thinking about, well, what's going on in the time that Betty Friedan writes this book. Why does she write it? What is going on in this time period? That drastically changes women from the Rosie the Riveter figure to what we're going to see in Housewives of the 1950s. So in 1963, Betty Friedan conducts a survey for her Smith College classmates in their 15th anniversary reunion, and she found that women were mostly unhappy with their lives. And she'd intended to only publish an article, but she ended up finding so much information that she did publish this book in 1963, so 6 years later. And there's sort of a basis for what she understands as the start of this issue, mostly surrounding, again, white women. And I'll show how that diverges a little bit this week and then next week as well. So in the 15 years after World War II, we have this need for women to go back into the homes, right? You have this Rosie the Riveter figure who is supporting women, picking up jobs in mechanics and engineering and manufacture. And then when the men come back from war, how do we get women back in their quote unquote place? And so there's a lot of different ways in which this occurs. One of them is because of suburban developments. And as Americans are moving away from cities, there becomes a GI Bill guaranteeing home loans, as well as the mass production of homes in general. And so with the baby boom, with the men coming back, getting with their sweethearts and getting married and having this big baby boom, right, of children. Hopefully you knew what baby boom came from, and boomers, right? So you have that happening in suburbia, and so people want to move out and have these little sort of neighborhoods with their children, and like the white picket fence and the American dream. So people want to move into their own home, their own space after World War II. And so these suburban neighborhoods are created. From the Khan Academy, built using the principles of the assembly line mass production, Levittown went from a potato field to a community of 82,000 people in less than a decade. Construction proceeded according to 27 distinct steps, from pouring a concrete slam foundation to spray painting the drywall. Trees were planted every 28 feet. Every house in the division had exactly the same floor plan. Residents reported that at night they sometimes walked into the wrong house by accident. With all of these cost-saving measures, the earliest Levittown houses were only $7,000 or $29 per month for a mortgage, compared to the going rate of $90 per month for an apartment in the city. So you can imagine this is ridiculously cheap. I mean, like, even comparatively, they're making it sort of insanely affordable for people to have housing. And so these massive suburban areas are created. And you get the idea of like why people think they're sort of creepy and strange in this very sort of clinical way that they're being created. But at the same time, $7,000, like, let's do it, right? So you even see some of the ways in which that occurs in cities today, and the ways that like blocks are created and such, but not really in the same way. So not only are these bills and sort of this idea of creating families and moving into this white picket fence establishment, but you have advertising and images doing it as well. And I'm going to show you how Betty Friedan breaks it down, because she has a particular way of looking through it, which I think is interesting. But I'm going to show you some images here as we start out, because even as you start to look at the way that women are being represented, it's really not surprising the way that women are manipulated and treated, that they are lesser than in the creation of these types of images. These ones are especially awful. Um, you have to make sure that you have a pen small enough for your hand. It's very concerning. These feel very similar to some of the anti-suffragette cartoons that we saw in the 1900s, right? In the early 1900s with, oh, men are suffering so much because now they have to do this work too. There are some films that look at some of these ideas of what's really going on in the 50s and 60s that Friedan really found herself in. Mona Lisa Smile is one of those movies if you haven't seen it. It's a really phenomenal film about an art history teacher who's not married. Oh my God, it's like my life. Which talks about this unmarried woman who's played by Julia Roberts coming to teach these girls art history and kind of experiencing this backlash from the culture of sort of young girls getting married and sort of given privileges that are not given to unmarried women. And they always talk about this new degree of PhD, which is putting husband through, which is something that was popularized during this time as well. So, and it's really a lot about questioning women's roles as a whole in this Wellesley College in the 1950s that was specifically for females. And I'm going to show you a clip here where there's this conflict between Professor Catherine Ann Watson, who's Julia Roberts, and the recently married student Elizabeth Betty Warren, who's Kirsten Dunst. And Warren writes this negative review about how Watson is really trying to break down the ideas of marriage and of the nuclear family and isn't supporting sort of Wellesley's dedication to the married woman and sort of what sort of things that married women should be given over unmarried women. I'll have this link on the Moodle as well, but here is the clip for you guys.
Thank you. Slide. Contemporary art.
No, that's just an advertisement.
Quiet. Today you just listen.
What will the future scholars see when they study us? A portrait of women today? There you are, ladies. The perfect likeness of a Wellesley graduate, magna cum laude, doing exactly what she was trained to do. Slide. A Rhodes Scholar. I wonder if she recites Chaucer while she presses her husband's shirt's slide. Now you physics majors can calculate the mass and volume of every meatloaf you make. Slide. A girdle to set you free. What does that mean? What does that mean? What does it mean? I give up. You win. The smartest women in the country. I didn't realize that by demanding excellence, I would be challenging. What did it say? What did it say? The roles you were born to fill. Is that right? The roles you were born to fill? It's my mistake. Class dismissed.
So in this film, you have this powerful moment when these things are breaking down, right? And you start to see women, especially in this film, kind of questioning who they are. As Kirsten Dunst isn't actually happy in her marriage, but she's trying to pretend like she is, right? That this is how it's supposed to be. So what did it mean to be feminine in the 50s and 60s? What did this construct mean as a whole? It really became sort of this core because of Freudian theory, who said that no greater destiny than glory in their own femininity, that they should only seek fulfillment as wives and mothers. As Betty Friedan said, women who suffer this problem, in whom this voice is stirring, have lived their whole life in pursuit of the feminine fulfillment, and yet could never find it, right? This kind of core concept of what femininity meant was something that couldn't be achieved, right? It's because it's quiet, it's unemotional, does their duty without complaints, right? This idea of feminine was not realistic, right? If you're a person with actual feelings. They were taught to pity the neurotic, unfeminine, unhappy women who wanted to be poets or physicists or presidents. They learned that truly feminine women do not want careers, higher education, political rights, the independence, and the opportunities that the old-fashioned feminists fought for. As she talked to doctors about their actual experience with women instead of the theories, I became aware of a growing body of evidence, much of which has not been reported publicly because it did not fit into current modes of thought about women, evidence which throws into question the standards of feminine normality, feminine adjustment, feminine fulfillment, and feminine maturity by which most women are still trying to live. And this came with the price of, even as Betty Friedan says, article covers that feature articles such as If You're a Woman, Don't Vote in 1960, which was supposed to be slightly comedic, but really sort of said, in the pre-19th Amendment era, the American woman was placid, sheltered, and sure of her role in American society. She left all the political decisions to her husband, and he, in turn, left all the family decisions to her. Today, a woman has to make both the family and the political decisions, and it's too much for her. Which doesn't really sound that funny, right? And you can see these statistics of the average married age was 20, 14 million engaged by 17, and this age dropping drastically. Women were going to college, 47% of them in 1920, 35% in 1958. 60% dropping out of college once married, putting husbands through, like I said. Women having more children, passing India in birth rate, and 3 out of 10 women dyeing their hair blonde. You had women trying to get this very particular body type that wasn't too skinny or too curvy, and really kind of thrusting this on young girls as well. Metrocol was a big sort of diet aid in the 1950s. This sort of gross drink. The Metrocol steak. Ooh, cut that steak with, like, what is that even? And so you had commercials like this one, which you guys can watch. I will put it on. Well, we can just play it.
Is this the day you finally do something about your weight?
May I help you? No, thank you. Here we are. This looks nice. This will never do. Oh, nothing seems to fit. Would you like to look at some 14s?
Is this the day? All it takes is a little bit of willpower and Metrical. Metrical isn't chicken and dumplings. It is a simple, safe way to lose weight without hunger. Perhaps you'd rather not use Metrical as your total diet, but surely you have enough willpower to try it for 2 meals a day with a moderate third meal of your usual food. You can still lose weight. Is this the day you finally do something about your weight? All it takes is a little bit of willpower and Metrical.
I know all of us have always wanted a loud, booming male voice to tell us that our weight is not controlled. We also had economics classes becoming more prevalent in high school because they believed that girls learning young how to take care of a home would help them be happier in the future. And even we saw to the effect that American girls began getting married in high school as well, and started going steady at 12 and 13. In junior high, manufacturers put out brasiers with false bosoms of foam rubber for little girls of 10. There's an advertisement that Friedan talks about that says she too can join the man trap set. And you can see even how weird some advertisements get for things like Love's Baby Soft. Because innocence is sexier than you think. It's crazy to even look at something like tampon advertising. You have something like these advertisements during World War II that sort of encourage women who are working on the front, who need something that is reliable, versus what comes in the 50s and 60s for tampon advertisements, as well as feminine hygiene. We also have feminine hygiene advertisements coming out, and this is something I learned this year, which always happens to me, is that Lysol was indeed used for feminine hygiene and not for cleaning. So used on your vagina, which sounds Horrific. Lysol has amazing proved power to kill germ life on contact. Truly cleanses the vaginal canal, even in the presence of mucus matter. Thus, I cut off the rest of it. But I mean, this sort of comedic way that Lysol is being advertised, and that women have sort of issues with scent, that her marriage was marred by one neglect few husbands can forgive, that she had to use Lysol to fix it. And then you can use it on your counters. I don't know. There's also this idea of the quote-unquote idea of feminine hygiene, which comes because of the 1950s and the Comstock Act. And these were banned. The idea of sort of menstrual conversations about obscene materials made it illegal to sell or advertise products that were labeled contraceptives or anything that referred directly to sex. And it was perpetuating this sort of negative stereotype about menstruation for everyone, about hygiene. And so that is why today we still call it feminine hygiene, as you can imagine, which is pretty strange. And you can see that these types of advertisements are kept up later as well. I think the middle one is more from like the 70s with that plaid shirt. But I used to suffer from menstrual cramps. I feel sorry for any woman who suffers from menstrual pain, but I also feel sorry for her husband. Okay. This was also the time that birth control comes into use. We have the Planned Parenthood being developed. And so there are elements of supporting women in their movement towards sort of more sexual freedom. And you'll have sort of comedic records like Lorraine Allen Dawn's The Pill. Now, birth control was somewhat contentious, and also including the opening of Planned Parenthood. There wasn't always sort of as much respect and consideration for BIPOC women. We have sterilizations occurring, some really sort of horrific events that we can't get into super extensively right now, but it's I wanted to mention it because it doesn't necessarily mean that Friedan or Planned Parenthood really supported sort of all women historically. And we have women coming out and speaking against it, fear that sort of Planned Parenthood and other organizations are trying to stop women from having bigger families or from Black families having more children. So there's definitely fear of that occurring as well, which is totally warranted in the way that the health community has sort of treated the BIPOC women in general. And sadly, we can't get into it again extensively, but there is this larger issue and conversation sort of on the opposite side where Black families are fearing sort of genocide and restriction of their family size and procreation, etc., by the government. There's also sort of fear of taking birth control from Planned Parenthood in the way that the medical community sort of treated white women and Black women differently. So there's some information about that in here as well. As Betty Friedan discusses in the Feminine Mystique, kitchens again become the main home for women, and many are making sort of customized spaces. Women are trying to engage in part-time jobs to put husbands through school. She states that the shortages in nursing, social work, and teaching professions cause crises in almost every American city, but they continue to sort of keep their place in the home. The Suburban Housewife, she was a dream, the image of young American women, and the envy, it was said, of women all around the world. The housewife was healthy, beautiful, educated, concerned only about her husband, her children, and her home. She had found true feminine fulfillment as a housewife and mother. She was respected as a full and equal partner to man in his world. She was free to choose automobiles, clothes, appliances, supermarkets. She had everything that a woman ever dreamed of. So when The Second Sex comes out in 1949, which is this revolutionary piece of kind of feminist discourse in France, they state in America that this woman problem no longer existed. If a woman had a problem in the 50s and 60s, she knew that something must be wrong with her marriage. This idea must only be sort of a French problem, that a woman is not liberated. And many therapists went to call this the housewife syndrome, even as they sort of had all of these mothers and women coming to them and saying how dissatisfied they were or how unhappy they were. They still called it the housewife syndrome. In 1960, the problem bursts open with the Time cover, The Suburban Wife, an American Phenomenon, having too good a time to believe they should be happy, even having such shows as The Trapped Housewife being played on television. These news weeks start appearing where people are talking about this issue but still excusing it away. Young wives with brains, babies, yes, but what else? Talking about how women are too educated and that must be the issue, because she doesn't realize how lucky she is not to have to work. So what was this woman's problem, right? Was it that they were too educated? Was it that it was merely the problem with the most recent women's rights movement? They were admired, envied, pitied, theorized over until they were sick of it, offered drastic solutions or silly choices that no one could take seriously. And it's funny that even psychiatrists and therapists are saying, look, this is a housewife syndrome, but at the same time, they're saying that unmarried women were happier than married ones. Could this have to do with the domestic routine? All of these ideas that are listed here by Betty Friedan are these issues that women have experienced that have been ignored, such as menstruation, sexual frigidity, promiscuity, pregnancy fears, etc. She even talks about ever so briefly that women are taking tranquilizers, and because of this housewife fatigue that's going on, where women are sleeping more than 10 hours a day. And women are being prescribed at this time by physicians Valium, Ativan, Xanax, Klonopin, clonazepam. I mean, it is insane what they are giving women at this time to sort of sedate them, and to see it in sort of commercials and using like antipsychotics or anti-seizure medication. You know, and if this seems sort of vaguely familiar, you have this kind of narrative playing out in The Queen's Gambit, right? With the taking of sort of these tranquilizers by Alma Wheatley, or sort of just like generally this like conversation about pills in the 1950s very much comes into play in The Queen's Gambit as well. So this is not something that was sort of not known to people. And basically telling people, right, that now that you can cope with all the issues that you're dealing with, right, all these sort of psychotic issues, sort of sedating them so that they can cope with their lives, right? I have a link to a bunch of different sort of articles about that as well, or an article list of advertisements. But like Friedan said, we can no longer ignore the voice within women that says, I want something more than a husband and my children and my home. And as we talked about in class, this idea of Kinder, Küche, you know, my German is as bad as my French, children, kitchen, and church, making sure to keep women in the homes. She states, when then does the image deny the world? When does it limit women to one passion, one role, one occupation? Not long ago, women dreamed and fought for equality and their own place in the world. And she shows how it can be traced through some of these magazines, like McCall's, where these women are kind of emerging as these frilly, fluffy characters with no personality, and kind of mirrors what they're supposed to want, right? And then very shortly after that, with General Mills, as well as other magazines, you have this just a housewife idea. That she's in fact the most remarkable woman, occupation housewife. And so all of a sudden these images of women in this particular way burst on the scene of trying to make sure to put women in the home and to sort of get these stories that work to that idea and that narrative. And it's really scary to read some of these things, like The Good Wife's Guide, where it tells you how to keep your husband interested, right? And to make sure that he's happy, and the things that you know that you should do as a woman. Be happy to see him, greet him with a warm smile, and show sincerity in your desire to please him. A good wife always knows her place. Don't ask too many questions. Let him talk first. Remember, his topics of conversation are more important than yours. I mean, how are these images of the 1920s so much different than the 1950s, right? What has 30 years gotten us in conversations about representations of women in media? And it gets even scary when some of these advertisements take sort of wife beating comedically. This one that ran for the Detroit bowling alley from 73 to 80, even though many people protested, which was have some fun, beat your wife tonight. And while this was a commentary on beating your wife at bowling, it's not funny, right? This is not comedic. This is not, it gets your attention, I guess, you could say, but it's sort of glamorizing or joking about the abuse of women. And it's not that this was sort of a event that wasn't happening in other advertisements, right? Husbands beat wives, which is a joke about Betty Crocker, but it's like, that's not funny, right? It's not funny and silly and fresh, right? The country needs more wife spanking. Is it always illegal to kill a woman? Broomsticks is one of those that I find especially frightening. That talks about a game that men play. But if you don't want to play our way, take off our pants and go home. What does that even mean? And when you have an image of a naked woman amongst a group of laughing men, what will people say about us today? I mean, it's not that we're not engaging in these same sort of ideas and constructs about women, whether or not they're maybe as obvious or they're just as obvious. What would someone say about the way that we think about women today? So what is the feminine mystique? Friedan describes it as that women are or could be completely fulfilled by devoting their lives full time to being housewives and mothers, and that this one devotional idea, this one sort of one dimension of who a woman is something that they should be fulfilled by. Um, and of course, this wasn't true. And they talked about it being biologically ingrained as women, right? That they should be devoted to their femininity, to this nurturing aspect of their biology, and that they should take it on and know that this is their real purpose in life. So this book really started the second wave of feminism for a lot of women in realizing that they weren't alone in some of these issues that were going on at the time. Now, I am going to be stopping it here for this week, but it is not a completion of this presentation, like I said before. I will finish it out with the civil rights movement and sort of our take from Black women in their role in sort of as housewives as well. So we will see that next week. I will talk. I did want to point out that when discussing sort of the second wave of feminism as well as Betty Friedan, that her conversations about sort of womanhood, again, like I previously stated, don't necessarily coincide with ideas relating to sort of gay women, as well as Black women or BIPOC women. So, for example, Betty Friedan says that lesbians are the lavender menaces, which is actually pretty funny in that lesbian women took this up as sort of a calling card during the time and walked around and wore shirts featuring that phrase. But again, you have this sort of separation, and this is happening in the first wave of feminism as well, that women who don't kind of fit into this like heterosexual and normative dialogue don't really fit into who's sort of supposed to get rights. So Betty Friedan obviously calling lesbians lavender menaces, and having to sort of deal with that backlash. As well as Black women. So you had a lot of Black women who are working in households and being housewives to white women. You can see that in movies like The Help, where you have this sort of different dialogue about what sort of white heteronormative women are doing at the time, and then what Black women, lesbian women, Native American women, BIPOC women in general. By the 1960s, almost 90% of women in the South were domestic workers taking care of white women's families. Alice Walker, who's a famous poet, wrote about her mom being a housewife for a white family. So you can read that if you would like. It's pretty powerful. Um, I've really appreciated the work of Mary Simbande, where she looks and investigates sort of the housewife as this very sort of heroic figure, and so creates these sort of beautiful sculptures and installations of life-size figures in which she creates art to sort of embrace the power and the heroic um, strength of these women who were sort of right taking care of white households, and what sort of heroic nature and beauty sort of lies in who they were as individuals, right? Rethinking that narrative entirely. And this has helped to sort of promote disparities between Black and white women historically. Today, even an average of 78% of Black women with children are employed compared to 66% of white, Asian American, and Latinx moms. Although 80% of Black mothers are breadwinners, and the average they make is $36,000 a year, which is 20% lower than white women. And so this has sort of continued to occur in today's sort of society, in this separation between sort of Black mothers and white mothers, and how that affects sort of women and Black families economically as well. You also have that women and mothers are a big part of the civil rights movement. A lot of these sort of grassroots organizations are run by mothers. So not, again, something we can get into necessarily, sadly. But again, here is that separation between sort of second and first wave of feminism. So two big figures that we have in this movement artistically are Judy Chicago and Miriam Shapiro. And these two artists are really in this founding period of the second wave of feminism and become very important to the narrative of art making at the time, because it's very much founded in very overt vaginal imagery and feminine imagery having to do with sort of kitchens and pinks, etc. So sort of reclaiming some of those ideas that have been previously sort of marginalized, including sort of needlework, pottery, and dealing with sort of highly collaborative art as well. So Judy Chicago develops a feminist art history program in 1970 at Fresno State College in California. She ends up leaving it in 1971 and picking it up at Cal Arts. She is also a big part of the Women's Building founders. Which is an important part of the feminist movement as well, in sort of publishing. As well as an inclusive space for all women in the community, had gallery space, cafe, bookstore, and offices for Feminist magazine. So, while Judy Chicago is working on this program in 1970 to 1971, she's doing work of her own. So I'm going to kind of intersperse this because we're going to talk about Woman House by her in a minute here. But she does this announcement for an exhibition, and it features her at Cal State University, and it features Judy Chicago in a sweatshirt stating her name, as well as Jack Glenn, who's over here in the back looking glum, and then Alana Hamilton Cook, who was I think like a friend's girlfriend. Oops, sorry. But what was important about this moment and these images that comes into sort of contemporary life as well, is that Judy Chicago ended up changing her name. She originally was Judy Gierowitz from her last marriage. And in the announcement of her show, she stated, "Hereby divests herself of all names imposed upon her through male social dominance and freely chooses her own name, Judy Chicago." This name had kind of been put on her kind of as a nickname by Ralph Nelson because of her thick Chicago accent, and she was also born there, as well as him stating that Judy was a fighter. And she didn't really feel this connection to her married name after her husband passed, and so she wanted to take on this sort of identity of her own, thus calling herself Judy Chicago. It became an iconic image for feminist women and producing art and encouraged women to fight for what they wanted. And has been created today, 2018, so about 3 years ago, on the cover of T magazine, as well as you can see Judy Chicago's here on the right, excuse me. Being photographed by Collier Shore, who's a very famous photographer, and sort of referencing some of these ideas as well in this spread. So Judy Chicago ends up moving her program to Cal Arts and sort of recreating it there, as it still sort of is run alternatively to like 94, I think, at the other college I just lost, Fresno State College. So Judy Chicago and Miriam Shapiro continue this program, which is called FAP, Feminist Art Program, at Cal Arts from 71 until 76. It becomes a sort of very revolutionary program that is really specifically about formulating a space for women and women artists. Judy Chicago felt very much that all art history, all narratives, all ways that we teach art are invested in sort of male narratives, and she needed to sort of change that through changing these individual women. They would have their own studio spaces off campus to remove sort of those male influences from art history as well. So there was about 15 students in both programs, one at Fresno and then one at Cal Arts, and some of them moved to Cal Arts with Judy Chicago. But she talked about the word cunt. I have a video about it on Canvas, but wanted people to use this idea sort of more universally and to talk about experiences, to try to free women from negative attitudes about the female anatomy and bodies. So I'll play that here. If it makes you uncomfortable, you are welcome to skip this portion. So here's that video of Judy Chicago talking about cunt.
We have definitions of ourselves by men. Cunt is passive, cunt is receptacle, cunt is vessel, cunt is giver of all rewards and blessings, mother. Cunt is evil, demonic, will swallow you up, blah, blah, blah. But those are all projections, fantasy projections. But what we have to do is we have to seize our own cunt, grasp it firmly in our hand, and proceed to announce what it is. Announce that it's real, that it's alive, that it's aggressive, that it's outgoing, that it's, that it looks like this, that it needs this, that it has this kind of dimension. And what does that mean? That means to really take control of our own identity as women. And our cunts are symbolic of our identity as women. When people when people put people down by calling them cunts, it means that cunt is an image of contempt. That is what a cunt is. Well, we have to get hold of our own image. Take it over. That's why I changed my name. Because I took hold of my own identity. And I said, henceforth, I shall determine who I am. I reject the definition society has given me. Because the definition society has given me are non-operable. They are incorrect. They are non-operable. They are crippling. They are dehumanizing. So I take hold of my identity. I take hold of my cunt. Henceforth, I shall say what cunt is. I shall build cunt myself.
So you can see that Judy Chicago has this sort of very powerful voice, right, and narrative, and that in sort of reclaiming, even more directly, sort of reclaiming vaginal imagery and these narratives about women as being housewives, is about reclaiming this power that's been taken away from them, right? So she had like cunt cheerleaders, right? So there's all this narrative about sort of how women are able to take back that power that they've sort of lost. Here's Miriam Shapiro as well in her studio. And some of the work by them as well. Because you can see that in a lot of their work, you have sort of nuanced ideas forming around sort of vaginal imagery as a whole. And here's some images of Judy Chicago teaching. As well as the students. So again, those 15 students that were included in this program. So with Judy Chicago and Miriam Shapiro at the center here. So they started to do works such as these in encouraging these students to sort of deal with some of these ideas that Chicago is discussing. So, for example, you have this series of photographs in which they're dressing up as sort of female types. So, whore, Cupid doll, Victorian horror, kind of like engaging with this narrative about what women look like historically, and how that sort of influences how they've been treated, and kind of reclaiming those images as well. One of the artists that I wanted to talk about is Suzanne Lacy. Suzanne Lacy was a student of Shapiro and Chicago, who ended up working, kind of finding Judy Chicago at Fresno State College. She states that she went there because of her boyfriend or something. She didn't have like a really good reason for going to Fresno State College. But she found herself studying psychology, and when she would kind of ramble about Freud, her fellow classmates would call her the quote-unquote angry woman. And at first, Judy Chicago didn't really want to take Suzanne Lacy in her program because she wasn't specifically an artist. However, Lacy, along with Faith Wilding, were able to sort of tweak her work and kind of make her into an artist, which is kind of interesting and random. But they had to kind of commit to this new way of working, and so she took psychology in this sort of different direction. And they started looking at this kind of large course load where they were investigating artists that have never been sort of discussed art historically. So Frida Kahlo, Mary Cassatt, and so she follows Judy Chicago to Cal Arts, and studies there with Alan Capro, we've talked about, and started thinking about this construct of what happenings were. She was doing that sort of work as well. So, for example, she did Cinderella in a Drag Star. And here's a description of that performance here. She also did some really founding imagery about rape and rape discussions in her book Rape Is, as well as a couple performances. So again, another warning, this is some very triggering discussions of rape here to come in the next couple of slides. So Rape is her really first artist book that kind of moves her into fame, because rape is not being discussed at this time socially as much as it is today. It's sort of hush hush. You have women wanting to raise awareness about this issue. And so she has this kind of book that's closed and sealed, to kind of talk about the private nature of this book and these images. And it's supposed to be kind of riffing off Happiness Is sort of books, which I'm not super familiar with sort of personally, but you get this sort of idea about having sort of a larger title in which you kind of break down the ideas page by page. So I only have a couple of images here. They get quite a bit graphic, so I didn't include them in the PowerPoint. But they're this really powerful statement about all of these individual personal stories about what rape is to women, right? And really starting to have this dialogue that is not being discussed sort of previously to the 1970s. You also have them making a series of different performances like Ablutions by Lacy, Chicago, Orgel, and Ramani, all discussing sort of personal ideas surrounding rape and sort of what they've experienced personally, and then working that out in performances. Lacy would take this a bit further with her work with Labowitz called 3 Weeks in May from 77, in which they had these massive maps of LA spread out in a city mall shopping center, and that this performance would last for 3 weeks in 1977, in which they would investigate ideas and constructs surrounding sort of rape and rape narratives. And very specifically, again, Lacy's working in this construct of happenings, similarly to Alan Capro, and she would have this contact with the LA Police Department, and there was an officer that would work with Lacy and give her specific information about cases of rape that occurred the day before. So reports and ideas that had been, well, reports and events that had happened the day before, they would mark it on the map and then come to discuss these events. So really kind of chronicling rape for 3 weeks and sort of where people are stating that a rape occurred, what is occurring to women in this area, and really showing how frequent this is, and how much of an issue this is, even in the city of LA alone. And so there was numerous performances that happened in this 3 week time, as well as conversations about rape and about what women have been dealing with sort of historically, as well as sort of today. So I'm going to show you some pictures of one of the fundamental works developed by Judy Chicago and Miriam Shapiro, which is Woman House. And I'm not going to talk a lot about it. I just want you to kind of look at it. I'll state what work it is as I sort of go through the rooms. But we'll talk about this more extensively next week. But think about sort of these works and ideas as I click through sort of Woman House. So Woman House became this space that Shapiro and Chicago made with these 15 students in 6 weeks. It was a house that was condemned, and so it was destroyed by the city as planned in 1972. But it became this moment where the women had to work together to show their own personal experiences and this environment to work out sort of female reality and the real facts of women's lives, feelings, and concerns. And so it became this monument to sort of looking at female ideas and narratives. So here are some brochures from it. And here's the house on the left as they sort of got it ready to begin their work. This is very much sort of supposed to look like a Betty Crocker dining room with a comparison to kind of an Anna Peel image on the back wall. So the food looking sort of very fake and plastic. This is menstruation bathroom. Nightmare bathroom. And lipstick bathroom. This bathroom really reminds me of the scene in It, not only sort of the original, but more specifically the 2017 one, just because it's slightly more sort of gory, but relating to sort of blood and bathroom spaces. And I have some mention of that here. And I put the clip on Canvas if you're not familiar with it, but you definitely don't have to watch it if you are horrified by horror movies. But there's just sort of larger narrative about Beverly, who's this character here featured here, the only female in this sort of cast of boys, and some of the issues that she's dealing with her father, who has been sort of sexually molesting her. And this is a quote here about that. This is a hallway with aprons. Leah's room had performances occur where a girl would sit and do her makeup. And there are only two images specifically of sort of women, quote unquote, like large scale women in the spaces, one being in a closet. And another being a bride with a train that moves sort of all throughout the house, I think into a bedroom, if I'm not mistaken. Let me see. Goes down the stairs, trails to the pantry, and past the kitchen, where it ends. Sorry, so no connection to the bedroom. It ends in the kitchen where the women belong, right? Quote unquote. And this was also a space for performances, which we'll again talk about next week, such as Cock and Cunt Play, and Waiting by Faith Wilding, which are both on canvas as well. So take a look at these images and think about them for next week, and we'll sort of discuss them ever so briefly next week, and we move in sort of more contemporary art, focusing on some of these themes of contemporary art. So I will see you all next week.